Hello, my name is Professor Ray Chauduri, and I am here today on behalf of the International Parkinson's Disease and Movement Disorder Society and as part of the MDS Oral History session. I have here with me Professor Per Odin, and it gives me great pleasure to talk to him about his work and his life and his future directions at the ongoing International Congress of the Parkinson's Disease and the Movement Disorder Society, which is currently being held in Nice in France. So firstly, I'd like to introduce it to you, my long-term colleague, collaborator and friend, Professor Per Odin. I'll pass it on to Per to introduce himself.
Thank you, Ray. I'm Per Odin. I'm Swede. I come from Lund presently, Professor of Clinical Neuroscience there. And I'm very happy to be here to talk with you.
Per, it seems opportune to first start off with your early career, and then we develop your story.
Yes.
So tell us a little bit about your early career. How did you get into the whole educational sphere, into medicine, and then we take it from there.
Yes, if we start from the very beginning, I was born in Uppsala. Spent my first 5 years in Uppsala, which is a university town 60 kilometers north of Stockholm in Sweden,
Yes.
Sweden's oldest university. And then the family moved to New York for 2 years, 1962 to 64. So we lived on Manhattan for a couple of years. My father did research at Mount Sinai Hospital there. Then returned to Sweden, to a mid-sized town on the Swedish west coast, Halmstad, where I grew up and had my school education. And during those years I got an interest in medicine, I think, and that was probably because of family. My grandfather was a physician. He was professor of internal medicine at Gothenburg University, and my father was head of clinical chemistry at Halmstad Hospital. So then I applied for medical school in Uppsala, which started in 1976, and I finished that in 1982. And during those years I also slowly got more contact with research, with experimental research, and decided to do a PhD thesis starting immediately after the studies, 1982, with cell biological questions. We worked with so-called cell adhesion molecules. That's how cells recognize each other and how they contact each other. So that became then a thesis in 1987.
So that's when you left Uppsala after that?
Yeah, that's when I left Uppsala and came to Lund University.
Yeah.
And
so tell us a little bit about what took you into the field of neuroscience and specifically perhaps more with Parkinson's, work related to Parkinson's disease.
yes, when I came to Lund, I relatively quickly got integrated in the group around Anders Björklund and Olle Lindvall working with cell transplantation. They had actually just done their first patients with implantation of fetal dopaminergic cells when I came, and so I started to work in that group, and that was, as we know, Parkinson patients, so it was natural to connect to Parkinson and movement disorders. And so together with Olle and others, I took care of the transplanted patients, but we also worked clinically with movement disorders, so we set up a pretty nice movement disorder unit. We had a whole ward at the hospital for movement disorders and 8 beds and outpatient clinics and 6 PD nurses and so on. And then we thought that maybe we should do something more than cell transplantation, and we had heard Andrew Lees talking so nicely about apomorphine at that time. So in 1990 we went over to London to Andrew Lees and learned apomorphine treatment and used that very much then in Lund for the coming years until 96.
So it took you from cell transplantation to something which is very clinically available now and established as an advanced therapy.
Yes.
At that stage.
So I tried to, and I also tried to have some experimental research running in parallel. So we worked a bit with trophic factors, platelet-derived growth factor, PDGF, in the nervous system, experimentally in models of Parkinson and Huntington, and that was also a collaboration with Uppsala, with the Ludwig Institute there, which is the sort of birthplace of PDGF.
Okay. That's really impressive, the whole journey. I think that it's important to also, probably it will be important to you as well, but many people who undertake a journey like you did with PhD and then translating into clinical arena, are there any specific role models or heroes that you looked up at that period which might have defined your development?
Yes, I think that if one should, there are many, but if one should mention some role models. When I was young, I must say it was my father. He was a very impressive person, a nice person, and was for long the only role model I needed. But when I came to Lund, I think that Anders Björklund is probably an important role model. He's a brilliant experimental scientist. Ole Lindvall as experimental and clinical scientist and a fantastic friend, also important role model. And of course, like many, I think that David Marsden was a fantastic role model and hero in the area. We stayed 2 months in his department in 1995, and that was very impressive, I must say.
Yes. It's a winning combination. You had Anders Björklund and Ole Lindvall, with whom you worked together, which was... And in terms of your achievements, I mean, you have many, many achievements in the clinical arena, in the basic sciences arena, translational arena. What would you consider to be your most significant achievements or things that you're really proud of that you've achieved in the years that you've described?
Maybe I can continue my timeline and then I come back to your question.
Sure.
In 1996 we moved to Germany. That was mainly for familiar reasons. We moved to Hanover, and I got a position at the Hanover Medical School as consultant. And there we had the idea that Hanover is a transplantation-oriented hospital, so our idea was that we would bring in the cell transplantations to Germany. It proved that the Germans took the ethical questions around this very seriously, so it was difficult to set up a transplantation program at that time in Germany. So instead we started a DBS program in Hanover, the first DBS program in Hanover. So we had Professor Benabid there and so on. Then I got contact with Wolfgang Oertel in Marburg, and in 1999 he needed someone who could take the role as national coordinator for the new competence network Parkinson's disease that he set up in Marburg. So I was national coordinator for that during the first 2 years of the network. That was a great period because I got then to know almost all people who worked with Parkinson movement disorders in Germany. Then the position as head of neurology in Bremerhaven, the Bremerhaven Hospital, got free in 2001. And in Germany it's important to be head.
Sure.
And also Bremerhaven is located very nicely at the sea, and I love sea and the boats, and so I applied for that position and got it, and actually stayed there until 2018. But started to reconnect to Sweden again after some years, and in 2009 I got then a part-time adjunct professorship in Lund. So I spent 30% of the time in Lund and rest in Germany. And from 2013 I got a full professorship. So then I have gradually moved my focus to Lund and Sweden. And now I only have an outpatient clinic for movement disorders, 20% in Germany. Yeah, coming back to achievements, well, I think it's difficult to say because most of the things you do in groups and in collaborations. So to say what one has done oneself is not so easy, but maybe being part of the transplantation team in Lund was an important thing. Where we could show that this thing that one can transplant nerve cells into a Parkinson's sick brain and they survive and they have function. I think that was an important step that the group had. Well, and then I think I have done something good for the pump treatments, not least Duodopa, especially after it became commercial in 2004
and apomorphine as well.
And apomorphine as well, yeah. And together with you and your group and colleagues and the non-motor area that we have in this very nice collaboration with the non-motor people, been able to shed more light on the importance of non-motor symptoms in Parkinson's disease and also hopefully have improved the possibilities that they can be treated in different constellations. That has been one of the nicest research experiences in my life, I think.
I mean, if I remember rightly, you produced the first evidence of non-motor effect with advanced therapies
with Duodopa.
Yes. Levodopa infusion therapy, which was
together with you.
Yeah.
And well, what more? Well, we have in the last year started up a national Swedish Parkinson patient registry, which now has 7,500 patients in it. I think that can become a nice resource for research in the future. And well, I have been a lot doing networking, like the Competence Parkinson Research Network. I've also set up a corresponding Parkinson Research Network in Sweden, SWEPAR. I was involved in starting up the Swedish Movement Disorder Society and the Scandinavian Movement Disorder Society. So,
And you have a regular, very well-attended meeting of the society the Movement Disorders group.
Yes.
In Swedish.
Yes.
And I've been fortunate enough to be invited. So, it's a really impressive portfolio. It's impressive career development. Also translating your basic science knowledge to the clinical arena has been really, really of benefit, not just to, of course, us all, but also to patients. Tell us a little bit about perhaps the significant challenges that you might have faced, or barriers, because such great achievements often come with some difficulties in achieving those goals. So tell us a little bit more about that.
I think I have been lucky. I cannot say that I have had any major challenges.
Mm-hmm.
I think if I should mention one thing, maybe doing clinical research in a non-university hospital is a certain challenge that I realized after being back in the university environment in Lund. But Bremerhaven was not a university hospital. We tried to have both academic and more commercial research activities there, had research nurses and so, but it is more work to do research in a non-university surrounding, that is clear. But it can work, and I think it can be important also for hospitals of that type, larger non-university hospitals, to have research activities.
Sure. Yes. I mean, that's a really important point, isn't it, for people working in these smaller or maybe peripheral or maybe hospitals which does not have specifically a research portfolio, to be not to think that we can't do research. I mean, your work also shows that you can, even though that might be construed as a barrier to some extent. Interesting. So, I mean, one of the important issues or important aspects of the Congress or the society large is perhaps spreading the message to our younger colleagues and trainees, both in the field of training neurologists, geriatricians, or even allied health specialists as well. What are the sort of advices that you might give to our younger colleagues which can probably enable them to be, in future, to be somebody like you?
Well, I think that a key thing is to find research group that is successful, but maybe most of all with people who you like to work with. Research must make fun and to do research on your own, it doesn't work anymore. You have to have a group around you, and to find that group where you fit well and which is reasonably successful, that is a key thing, I think. Then when you have research going, to establish and run collaborations, I think is very important, to both on the national level and international level, and to be open for and to create collaborations. That is a major part of successful research, I think. And it's also one of the things that make research fun and exciting, to have a communication and collaborations. And well then, and to work hard, like many areas in life, research can be, it needs a lot of work. It's normally not a 40-hour per week work. It's clearly more if you want to be successful. And but on the other hand, it can be both your work and your hobby. It's often a lot of fun.
Yeah. So if you can derive pleasure from it, then you don't just look at it as work.
No.
But I think you make a very important point that modern research really needs to come in teams, and team working is, I think, and you're brilliant at it.
And maybe one can add also that one should really think about what type of research does one want to do. Purely clinical, purely experimental, or translational. I think maybe the most exciting parts are the translational activities and the connecting clinical activities to that.
Bridging the basic science with the clinical, yes.
Yeah.
And would you say that increasingly patient voices are also important in driving research?
Definitely, yeah.
So that's an important point to know. So, I mean, it's almost a slightly philosophical question here about if you wound back the clock, let's say another 20, 25 years, would you do anything differently, or would you broadly follow the same path you've taken?
Broadly, I would follow the same way. I'm very satisfied so far.
Yes, well, I think that's excellent to note. The other important thing, perhaps, to talk about would be the whole role of a clinical academic, which I think we touched upon. You touched upon about the translational aspect of it. In your advice to our young trainees, and you mentioned that you have to make a decision whether you want experimental or basic science or both. What is your view about training people up to be clinical academics, and what do you think their contributions might be? You being a classic example of somebody.
Well, I personally, I think it's good to have some experience with experimental research, if there is a chance to get that in some way, to see that at least for a period, and then come over to clinical. But of course you can also go directly into clinical research and become very good in that way. But again, you should look for good teachers and tutors. That's that, and the choice of research group is very important.
Do you think, how important do you think that, I mean, you mentioned working hard is one of the core underpinning principles of good research, perhaps. That always brings the inevitable question about work-life balance. What is your view on that?
I'm not so good on that.
But I think you'll find many colleagues who will tell you the same answer.
Yes, I mean, both clinical work as doctor and research makes so much fun that it's difficult not to work. So I think many of us, like yourself, we tend to work too much. But of course, at the same time, one should take the other part seriously, and one should try to set up routines so that there is time, of course, for family and friends and hobbies. In my case, mainly sailing and golf, and so I think that makes you feel better in the long run and have a better quality of life.
So it almost refreshes you for more work and more interest and more challenging, more work and so on.
A friend in Sweden who was also in our area, he said it's a privilege to be a neurologist and a neuroscientist. It's something that one can really recommend to our young colleagues. Yeah.
I mean, staying with that concept, it's another thing I wanted to ask you about, is that grants and papers, you know, these are important, shall we say, outcome measures that we are often judged by in the universities and colleges. What do you think we should be, or we should also spread a message to our juniors that they should be trying to enable themselves to be good writers and also think about potentially being parts of a grant or a collaborator, you know, grant application?
That is enormously important, yeah, to be able to write up results, but also to write applications. That is a large part of our work. One can think that it is sometimes too large part of the work with writing grant applications, but it is necessary, and it decides what you can do in science.
And it can enable them in their future career quite properly. Excellent. So, I mean, that brings us back to the framework of where we are today. So it's the International Parkinson's Disease Movement Disorder Society, which we are, of course, both active members of. How do you think the society itself has either supported or helped or developed your research strategies in your career?
I think that the society is very well functioning. It's an important part of our work life. It's important for education, for spreading information about these diseases on all levels, and of course as a platform for exchange of ideas and for establishment of research collaborations, and I think it is very important.
That's, I mean, and the global reach, I guess, that your work can enable through the society's work. You know, you've been a great ambassador for the society in that regard. Of course, we all very gratefully acknowledge your contributions. I suppose we've had a nice summary of your outstanding achievements and developments in your own career. But let's go back to our younger trainees again. And often there are very talented trainees or young researchers in any field, medicine or allied health. Do you have any specific advice or ideas about what sort of barriers that they may face, putting into perspective the barriers that you already described that you might have had in future?
Well, I think if we look on physicians, young physicians, I think in many countries, main thing is to find time for research, to get time for research, especially in your early years before you have become really productive. I think in Sweden we have solved that relatively well. If you are reasonably productive, you can get, for example, 50% time off for research. But in other countries, like for example in Germany also, it's more difficult. And that I think it is very important to have time for research. It's very difficult to do it only in evenings and weekends and so on.
Which again brings back to our work-life balance issue, I think, yes. So ring-fence time for research where people, once they decide what sort of research they want to do, that's the time when they concentrate on it, and that forms a regular part of their work schedule, rather than working just in the evening or weekends and so on.
It is also important, I think, that research pays off. It's hard work, but I think it's important for the system, the healthcare system also, that it is rewarded if you have a research education and research experience.
Yes. One thing that strikes me as also quite an outstanding feature of your career is the fact that you've very successfully been able to work between centers in your job. For instance, in the early phase you're working in Germany and then you're working in Sweden. Do you have any advice to our younger trainees also that if such requirements arise, the fact that they have to work in 2 or 3 different centers or 2 or 3 different countries should not put them off?
No. The other way around. I think it can be very stimulating. I mean, to move to another country like we did then is hard, a bit extra work. You have to re-establish your life, your social life. You re-establish your research. You have to re-establish your career in a new environment. But I think it also brings very much new experiences, new contacts. In total, one can really recommend to do that type of change 1 or 2 or a couple of times in life. And if you then find a possibility to keep the contact and can continue to have sort of more than one base, I think that is a very interesting situation. You can form a communication link between different surroundings in different countries concerning both research activities and the clinical activities in other ways. So one should not be afraid of having more than one place to work, if it's national or international, they say. And I think it's also good for the universities and the hospitals if they can have that type of communication and learn from each other and so on.
Brings the collaborative links as well.
Yes.
So, thank you. Is there anything else you would like to say for the sake of our audience in terms of research or any other advice, not just for our younger members but also for established professionals?
No, I think we have covered most things. I can just say that one can really recommend neurology, neuroscience, and not least movement disorders, both for research and for clinical activities. Very nice areas to work in.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure to interview
Thank you.
There it is for you, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Per Odin.